into the geopolitics that are affecting the energy transition ever more strongly, and to shed light on some important upcoming diplomatic moments. This week, already we've heard from scientists that we're likely to break through the 1.5C global warming limit before the end of this decade. And meanwhile, countries and companies that want to keep on profiting from fossil fuels are doing their best to keep them flowing and throwing the energy transition off course. Despite that, I did hear at the IRENA Assembly in Abu Dhabi this weekend a very strong determination among ministers from Europe, Africa, and small island developing states to push forward with building out more renewable energy. Certainly, we've got a fight on our hands that reaches far beyond just climate concerns, and our fantastic panel will be sharing their views on that today. But before I hand over to my colleague, Chloe Ferrand, to introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion, please allow me a small plug. We are biased, of course, but we think the best way to stay up to date on these issues is to start a subscription with Climate Home News, which gives you exclusive access to all of our coverage. And as a late Christmas present, everyone who takes out a new annual subscription before the 1st of February will be entered into a prize draw to win a free copy of Pete Bett's must-read book, The Climate Diplomat. So without more ado, let's hear from our experts. And if you have any questions for them, please do put those in the chat, the comments in the LinkedIn event, and I'll try and feed those through to the panel in the Q&A section later. Now, over to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone. So my name is Chloe Ferrand. I'm the editor of Climate Home News Clean Energy Frontier series, and I'm delighted to be moderating our panel today. And we're extremely lucky to have a fantastic lineup of speakers with us today. With us is Jennifer Morgan, a senior fellow at the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy, and a fellow at the Climate Policy Labs at Tufts University. You'll probably be familiar with Jennifer as she previously served as Germany's Special Envoy for International Climate Action and led Germany's delegation to the UN climate negotiations. She's also a former executive director of Greenpeace International. We also have Tulio Andrade. Tulio is the COP30 Chief Strategy and Alignment Officer and previously served as head of climate negotiations as Brazil's Foreign Ministry. Alex Rafalovich is the executive director at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and Alex is joining us from Colombia. And finally, we have Erica Westenberg, who's the Governance Programs Director at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. So thank you all so much for being with us today. We're really delighted that you were able to join us to reflect on what's been happening so far this year and where we're heading. So the format of today will be a little bit different. I'll be having short conversations around 8 minutes with each of our panelists, and then we'll opening up to questions for Q&A at the end. So as Megan said, if you have any questions, please pop them in the comment section of the LinkedIn Live, and we'll try and get through those at the end. Now, Jennifer, Megan has helped us set the scene here a little bit, but if we looked at what's been happening so far in 2026, we've had Trump making a play for Venezuelan oil. We've seen the US absolutely steadfast in its determination to acquire Greenland. Also, President Trump announcing he is pulling the US out of the UNFCCC, the IPCC, and many other international climate and environmental organizations. So given this context, do you think the threats to climate action have grown since the start of the year? Or are Trump's latest move actually maybe won't make that much of a difference when it comes to implementing and accelerating climate action on the ground?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be with this great panel. I think it really depends. I think it depends on two factors. One is the market, and the other is what other countries do. So, we have not seen any other countries following the Trump administration, leaving the UNFCCC, leaving the Paris Agreement. We've seen in Belém with a strong presidency from Brazil, but also strong engagement from all parties, a whole range of decisions moving forward, including not a decision, but a pathway forward. The transition away from fossil fuels was a big topic in Belém that doesn't fit with what the Trump administration would have hoped, I think. But we've gone through this before with the US, but I think what's making it different this time and why what others do is so important is the tactics that the United States is now using. It's very different than the first Trump administration. So I think we've all read about what happened around the IMO and the bullying tactics there, the pressuring of the European Union with Qatar to weaken methane regs and import more LNG, and then of course the recent events in Venezuela and the Greenland situation, which is certainly also linked to resources. So I think, I think on the market side of things, so you could see this just moving forward, right? And it having a big difference. But I think partially that depends on the market. Renewables are surging. We are aware of the IEA numbers in terms of how much they're expected to grow. Approximately 90% of global electricity demand going into 2027 is to be from renewables. Cost competitiveness, obviously, particularly for PV, solar PV, and onshore wind, is a key piece. And so watching prices, I would say, looking at what happens in the oil and gas markets, how far down are those prices allowed to fall? What does that mean for renewables? And that's key. The second, quickly, is just how other countries respond, both on the renewable side of things. Do they put in place? We've seen recent astounding developments in Pakistan and in South Africa, the policies and the fiscal instruments to move renewables forward, but also how do countries move forward on the transition away from fossil fuels. And here, I think the Brazilian presidency just has a great opportunity here to fulfill its commitment from the president to have an inclusive kind of participatory approach throughout the year on the roadmap, more of a platform or a process. I hope Tulio's sitting here so he can tell us what they're thinking about. But I think that would be a great contribution to this discussion, because then you could really get all of the different issues out on how to transition away from fossil fuels on the table. And then countries need to put forward their own roadmaps. They need to get forward, and particularly I think the EU needs to move forward on making some of the bilateral partnerships work in a way where there's benefits locally for other countries inside of the green supply chain.
You've written recently, reflecting on the COP30 outcomes, about this sort of battle between the petrostates and the electrostates, the countries actually betting and accelerating the electrification of their economies. When you're thinking about the market trends and prices, and countries maybe reflecting on their own fossil fuel transition, how do you see that shaping this year in terms of that petrostates versus electrostates narrative? Is it inevitable that petrostates will lose in the short term, or do you think that they could, continue to carry some really significant weight in this debate?
Well, I would never count the petrostates and the fossil fuel industry out. I don't think it's inevitable. I think they will continue to do everything that they can to continue and to grow. And we've seen now they have a very strong advocate in the White House with many, many new tools in the toolbox, unfortunately, to move that forward. So I think it's a highly volatile situation, and various things could occur that would also impact this. We now see the horrific things happening in Iran, but we saw back in June when the bombing occurred there, it could have resulted even in the Strait of Hormuz being closed. That would be a major energy crisis. And so the actions of Trump, but also of the petrostates, I think, is very, very volatile, and we need to be really keeping things on. I think China. I can't be talking about petro and electrostates without maybe slowing down a little bit, but we're seeing a structural decline of coal. We're seeing investment in the clean economy, and so I think if China, and I would never forget, grow, then I think that's really a game fully on. But nothing is inevitable when you're talking about the fossil fuel industry.
On China, China is due to announce its 5-year plan, which will go all the way to 2030 in March. Obviously, that's going to be a moment that's going to be watched particularly by climate and energy analysts. I'm just wondering if there's, understanding really the inner workings of climate diplomacy, having been in that position, whether there's anything that you're particularly watching in terms of signals or narrative, or anything that you'll be watching out for when China does make that announcement.
Certainly, I think a question is if there is anything on coal in this plan. The last NDC did have language on coal from President Xi Jinping, but the latest NDC and his contribution in New York to the Secretary General's event did not. We've seen it. It looks like there may be a structural decline, but we also know that they're building new. So, what are the plans on that? I think is one key piece. And another is on grid integration. So really looking into the details, is China building through its 5-year plans the infrastructure for greater growth of renewables in China so that they can build their own energy security, not be as dependent on coal. And certainly we see them not wanting to be too dependent on oil and gas and declining there as well, which links to the first two questions, I think would be key things to be watching for.
Yeah, that's interesting. And if we sort of look at, the diplomacy piece and climate diplomacy, this energy transition diplomacy, you've mentioned the US tactic at the IMO, which has been really to stall completely the agreement on reducing shipping emissions and having this sort of carbon levy. Do you think that we need to adapt how things are done in order to avoid petrostates or those really holding back the status quo from, or wanting to keep the status quo from holding back the rest of the world and accelerating climate action? I mean, we've seen that in Belém, these coalitions of the willing emerging around transition away from fossil fuels, the roadmaps. Do we need to change the way that these big moments of diplomacy are done in order to really encourage the acceleration of action from countries that are willing to go further?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. Obviously, if we could get the voting rules changed, that would be fantastic. But I think that's a long-term project. And I think there are approaches that have been used back at COP2 where there were footnotes of countries that didn't want to go along with decisions. These are incredibly difficult diplomatic decisions. So I think what you inferred within the Paris Agreement, you can have and do have coalitions of countries moving forward, whether it be the roadmap, which needs to be a bigger group, obviously, whether it be the global solidarity levies, now a group of countries moving forward to put levies on private jets first and business class tickets to raise funds, innovative funds for climate action, loss and damage adaptation, whether it also be bilateral collaborations. We have the EU-Mercosur agreement, which does have climate provisions in there. We do have the Clean Trade Investment Partnership between the EU and South Africa. I think it's now a moment where I can speak more from a European perspective, obviously, but that it is time for the European Union to put these different pieces together that it has and do a very strong climate foreign policy, energy security that makes it clear that the EU is transitioning away from fossil fuels. It has many of the policies in place, and it is going to be working economically with other key partners like Brazil, like India, like South Africa to be building the green economy across the board. And that needs to be much more resourced and active, and I think would bring tremendous benefits geopolitically, but also to people.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for those reflections, and hopefully we'll come back to you in the Q&A section. But thank you for sharing that with us. Tullio, I'd like to come to you next, please. So Tullio is the COP30 Chief Strategy and Alignment Officer, and well, COP30 does feel like a long time ago now, given the acceleration of international relations, geopolitics of the last few weeks. But I'm sort of still interested in how you reflect on what's happened in Belém. And, do you think that geopolitics played a larger part in shaping the outcome at COP30 than the presidency perhaps expected, even though, or even though the US stayed away? What do you make of those geopolitical forces at COP30 and how it impacted the outcome? Sorry, I think you're muted still.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and it's such to be here with you and such a distinguished panel. And for us, I wouldn't say that the geopolitics played a less of an important role than we expected. We actually were very much anticipating COP30 to be radically not only influenced but determined by geopolitics, and we. Given that geopolitical situation that is also compounded by socioeconomic challenges happening in countries, in all the letters that Ambassador Andre has issued, he reinforced three major objectives. The first one being strengthening multilateralism, the second being connecting the process to people, and the third being to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement, all in the context of climate urgency, but also just transitions. And we do think that given the geopolitical context, we achieved what we would be able to by actually having consensus around 56 decisions. We had also that leadership by President Lula in introducing not this unprecedented and needed debate around transitioning away from fossil fuels. We, from the very beginning, I think that this was also the feeling of many delegations. We knew from the start that given the geopolitical circumstances, this would be very hard to incorporate into the formal outcome, especially given that it was not part of the agenda. But we do feel that what happened in Belém was the beginning of structures changing. This debate is now there.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about that then. You're at the beginning really of your year of presidency, and you've got a lot of work on your plate to now deliver on these two roadmaps on the transition away from fossil fuels and ending deforestation, which will be outside a sort of parallel track to the formal negotiations, but which Brazil committed to do at the end of COP30. So can you tell us a little bit what's the plan for these then? Do you have a timeline? Do you know when we can expect some first drafts or some initial insights into what these roadmaps might hold?
So that's a great question, and I believe that this focus on draft goes back to Jennifer's point. One major outcome and one major change from COP30 is the transition from the negotiation to implementation. And we have to change our mental models as well. When we talk about drafts, this is not the mental model that we need for structural change in relation to fossil fuel. What we need now is really to reframe the transition away from fossil fuel, not only as a climate imperative, but actually something that is going to determine planning and instability from a much wider perspective that goes from financial stability, from social stability, from economic stability. If we don't have this planning beforehand, we are going to have major financial disruption in terms of risks, asset collapse, also understanding that our entire financial system is still reliant on the legacy of petrodollars and the liquidity that gave. We need to coordinate this transition right away, even to prevent major financial stability collapse. In addition to that, we also have, in realigning financial flows, we also have to deal with what this transition means in terms of labor force. We also have, in terms of the roadmap on forests, how this transition mean in terms of land use. So what we're talking about here is no longer just an environmental and climate imperative. This is an urgent framing, but it's also about everything that we do.
What does that mean in practice? So in terms of how you're going to shape these roadmaps, I think, Jennifer was making that point about platform or rather than process. Can you tell us a little bit about what shape these roadmaps are going to take, and when you might be able to give us a first insight into them?
Hopefully very soon. What it means in practice, very pragmatically, is that this conversation needs to go beyond the climate community to include not only the producers and consuming perspectives and views, but also financial stakeholders, infrastructure stakeholders, policymakers. So this really, what it means in terms of just transition. So it's a completely new approach. We also have to reflect also when it comes to the limits of the consensus from COP30, that this should not only be taken as a boundary of where multilateralism should go. We should take this as a learning to evolve multilateralism, to also acquire a speed that is necessary for implementation and to keep up the pace of global warming. The consensus-based approach that is absolutely important, especially as we have this as the key generator of international law. It's very important, but it's high time that we have a two-tier speed multilateralism that is equipped with the capacity to accelerate implementation. We have as a key deliverable, the Global Implementation Accelerator, but at the same time, we also, President Lula during the summit, he proposed the new council, the new UN Council on Climate Change, which is precisely focused on accelerating implementation. It's high time that we start thinking about how to evolve multilateralism, given the experience that we had at COP30.
Okay, so a bit light on the details, I guess, of what those roadmaps might look like, but we're understanding that you will bring stakeholders beyond just the strict climate space, involve finance actors and look at it from a broader economic perspective. What about the conversations around equity and timelines? Can you tell us briefly whether this is something that would be considered, for example, as part of these roadmaps?
Absolutely. So just before, and President Lula also issued a decree in December after COP30, mandating the key ministries within government to develop Brazil's own roadmap. And that builds on a lot of exploration that we, as when we were in the incoming COP30 presidency, we already did in terms of timelines. So what does it mean in terms of equity for timelines for producers, in terms of the dependency of a country on fossil fuels? This is one.
Sorry, Tulio, I think we can't hear you anymore.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So the level of wealth of a country, in addition to common but differentiated responsibilities, which is a key principle for our work and our regime. So how does all of this play out? So this is we have a lot of very interesting and solid work and criteria that have been advanced by a number of stakeholders, a number of experts, and we hope that this platform and this roadmap would be a way also to get together a lot of fragmented work that has already happened in this regard.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I think would love to come back to you as well in the Q&A section. I'm sure there's loads of more questions for you and the work of the presidency this year. But just in the interest of time, I'd like to now move on and go to Alex, if you're here, Alex. So Alex is the executive director at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and is based in Colombia. And Colombia has taken the lead in pushing forward on a coalition of the willing around the just transition away from fossil fuels. Sorry. Could I please request anybody on the call who's not a speaker to please mute, because it's a little bit disruptive. Thank you. So I was saying Colombia has taken the lead in pushing forward on the coalition of the willing around a just transition away from fossil fuels, and it's going to be hosting with the Netherlands the first global conference on the topic in April. So Alex, can you tell us a little bit about what you know about how the planning is going for that, and what do you think this conference can achieve in the current context?
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thanks to my other panelists for their inputs and insights, and of course to Climate Home News, which is one of the sites I check every morning before my coffee. So the plan for the conference in Santa Marta is to be the first focused international conference to discuss the transition away from fossil fuels and the phase out of fossil fuels. My understanding is that the government's hosting will be launching the website outlining the plan for the event in the next week or so, and there will be opportunity for a whole range of stakeholders to be able to contribute thinking. They want to consider the questions about what are the enabling conditions that will enable us to implement the transition away from fossil fuels. So what are the enabling conditions when we look at the financial system, the economic system, the legal and international cooperation systems, and then the enabling systems in terms of having popular support and building popular engagement. So that's kind of our understanding of how they want to approach the question. They are also expecting non-state actor, autonomous, parallel events. I know the University of Magdalena, which is the local public university, which has a really long history of looking at transitions away from fossil fuels because it is a large coal-producing region. They'll be hosting a series of events for public participation and discussion, bringing in stakeholders from academia and research institutions, but also, of course, there's a very strong local indigenous population that has a lot of experience with both the harms of fossil fuel extraction, but also trying to manage the transition to the new economy, Afro-descendant people, and other civil society observers. So I think it will be quite a large and historic event that will draw through thinking about how can we address the challenges that we have for realizing the phase out, whether those are structural economic challenges, whether they are existing financial flows, or whether they are existing legal structures, and then what are the opportunities and solutions that we can draw on, what are new models of cooperation. And I think it really builds off the points that both and Tulio have made about the fact that the question of the exit from fossil fuels is not a purely climate question, and it's a question about the structure of economic stability and planning, access to foreign currency for producers, price stability for consumers, access to energy for millions of people who don't have access to energy at the moment in the world. And so the idea of having a conference focused on the exit from fossil fuels started with the campaign for the Fossil Fuel Treaty, which was always a campaign based in that vision that the challenge of the exit from fossil fuels was not purely a climate challenge, that the climate challenge was there, but it represented an economic challenge. Managing the transition is a stability and an economic security challenge, which requires states to cooperate. Because I think you were talking about the distinction between petrostates and electrostates. And I think what we've also seen is there's now a real contrast between unilateral might makes right states and states that want to participate in an international system and cooperate. And the invitation to Santa Marta, I think, is an invitation to those states who want to cooperate on this question.
And I guess that this could directly feed into perhaps the process of Brazil's roadmap, fossil fuel roadmap exercise. I mean, in terms of outcomes for this conference, do you get a sense that what might be an outcome? Could we see, I don't know, a joint declaration, a stronger commitment still to commit yet to phase out fossil fuels? Like, what do you see could come out concretely of this conference?
No, I think the COP presidency in the closing plenary said they welcomed the conference and saw it as connected to the roadmap. So I think we're definitely optimistic that the discussions and the materials could be one contribution into the development of that process, and it would be a really exciting opportunity to connect those dots for sure. I think that there is an intention to develop some sort of chair summary or a summary of the discussions and the submissions and the ideas, so that can serve as a resource for both the roadmap, but also for UNFCCC discussions in general, but also for, and this is quite important, a second subsequent convening. And Tuvalu and Vanuatu have said that they would like to convene a second discussion, that they believe that it's necessary to continue, I think, as Tulu was saying, this second gear of multilateralism, where there is a high ambition coalition that wants to deal with this issue more directly, and that in some ways the outcome also of Santa Marta would be a clearer agenda for that subsequent convening, to see what is it that states that are committed to going faster and further on the fossil fuel phase out, what are the key pieces that they can actually take up in more detail, because this is the first time that they're having a detailed discussion about it. I think the COP discussion was very helpful and very historic in opening up. We need to have the discussion, but the discussion kind of stayed there a little bit. We need to have it. No, we don't want to talk about it. This is like, what are the actual constituent elements that we want to talk about when we go to look at how can we construct new forms of multilateralism that can accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It will be fascinating to watch. At the same time, as we're seeing this conversation happening, we've seen other signs from countries like India, for example, which recently, in the context of the investigation into Harjit Singh, who's a member of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, India's enforcement directorate has basically seems to be interpreting your work as a threat to their national energy policies. So I'm just wondering how, is there a bit of a misunderstanding as to what the work you're doing, what this kind of non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty is trying to achieve? And do you think that this is a risk a little bit this year, in the current context of having this pushback in terms of national security and energy security?
Yeah, thanks. And I obviously can't comment on specifics of an investigation, but I would say that that characterization of our work feels incorrect. I think from the beginning, since the proposal for a fossil fuel treaty started, it always came from the perspective that we need an international agreement and cooperation in order to manage the risks of the transition and accelerate the transition. And it needs to be based on the principles of equity and common differentiated responsibility. And what it needs to do is actually enable action and enable states to make more commitments on this activity. One of our starting positions is that it's very difficult for many states to make a clear commitment on the fossil fuel phase out, because the broader rules and international system is not set up to support them to do so. So how can we create the rules and a set of incentives that would allow them to make the decision to make that commitment? It's not a proposal that is seeking to impose or enforce a position on any country. So yeah, we wouldn't agree with that characterization. But also, I think as Tulio has said, there is a real energy security, economic security question around the fossil fuel phase out for every country, for all people, that needs to be addressed. And if we don't have a plan, there's a huge amount of risks around stranded assets, around toxic assets, and around losing competitiveness in an international market, which becomes increasingly electrotech focused. So actually economic security reasons why a shift away from fossil fuels is in the interest of most people, and having a plan is in the interest of most producers. But of course, there will always be a small number of vested interests that are trying to protect their existing interests.
Yeah, and I guess what we've seen happening in Venezuela also reinforces that need for a transition away from fossil fuels, and seeing how oil is being also that relationship to oil as power has been made very clear, hasn't it, since the beginning of the year?
That's right. I mean, it's the having oil or fossil fuel reserves can drive a risk of invasion or neo-imperial kind of dominance and attempts of control, which we've seen in the case of Venezuela. We've seen historically in cases of military intervention by the United States in the Middle East, but also the fossil fuel system currently fuels imperial war machines. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine is also connected to Russia's capacity to be able to fund that from its fossil fuel resources. So there's a real connection, and we do see, and actually the president of Timor-Leste, Jose Ramos Horta, who has supported the fossil fuel treaty for a long time, has said he sees it as a peace treaty. Like our capacity to help us wean ourselves off fossil fuels is also our capacity to reduce the kind of geopolitical violence that is driven by the concentrated forms of wealth that the fossil fuel system represents.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. I think that really neatly transition us to the next section of this discussion about minerals. So we've got Erica with us from the Natural Resource Governance Institute to discuss a bit what's going on in terms of the minerals that are so needed and required to manufacture clean energy technologies. And so, Erica, I'm wondering what you think and what you make of this new era of US resource imperialism and what that means for energy transition minerals. What sorts of impacts could this have this year, whether that's on mining projects or investment in the mineral supply chains? How do you reflect on what's been happening since the start of 2026?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of this great panel and this important conversation. Historically, what we know is that when the mining sector is driven by militarism and imbalanced economic and political power plays, what suffers is the environment, it's human rights, it's good governance. We don't see fair deals for producer countries, especially in fragile states and emerging markets. And those types of harms are, of course, very problematic in their own right, but they also make mining projects and investments less stable. So it's a major risk, and we've seen it before. I think in terms of the broader scramble for these resources, the mining sector is increasingly multipolar, and I don't think we should that others will necessarily, mirror US approaches. I think many countries and regions outside the US are actually using this as a moment to try to differentiate themselves by applying more enticing diplomatic and economic strategies in their engagements with mineral-rich countries.
And at the same time, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the US, but China is the big player that dominates the mineral supply chains, and particularly the processing of minerals. China tends to be a lot quieter in its approach to international relations. What are you watching this year in Beijing's response to global minerals policy and just the general geopolitical context when it comes to critical minerals?
Yeah, no, it's an absolutely key key issue. We're certainly going to be looking for more details about the initiative on economic and trade cooperation in green mining that China announced at the G20 in South Africa at the end of last year. The initial scope of that initiative was described as focusing on cooperation around things like investment and trade liberalization, social impacts, benefit sharing, technology transfer, but also kind of the broader policy environment and multilateral frameworks in the sector. So I think what we'll need to see is what actually happens in practice. What is the real scale and modality of investment? Which mineral corridors are prioritized, whether that's the copper belt or the lithium triangle or other zones. And I think it's a big question, how much and if good governance norms are going to be incorporated in that initiative, but most importantly in actual practice. I think another key factor will be how China responds to the numerous initiatives, whether in the US, EU, G7, Middle East, or multilateral spaces like the UN. So that dynamic is also a key point to watch.
And when it comes to the UN, I mean, in 2025, we saw growing efforts to address the environmental and social impacts of mining, energy transition minerals at the international level within the UN process. So there's been a push at COP30 to include energy transition minerals in the just transition text. It actually failed. We didn't quite manage to get there, but I guess it got really the conversation going within the climate space. And then at UNEA, the UN Environmental Assembly, in December, we saw a push led by Colombia once again, with a proposal to make mineral supply chains more sustainable and transparent. Again, it didn't quite manage to achieve what it was intended to do, but we are going to see more dialogue this year around this. So we are seeing this push for minerals discussion and governance at an international level. What are you watching this year in terms of where this could go? And especially at a time when we're seeing the US completely shake the international order and international organizations, like how do you see that having an impact on those discussions?
Yeah, so I mean, not having that specific reference to transition minerals in the final COP30 text was a missed opportunity. But I agree. There's indeed no question. There's no question that transition minerals really for the first time emerged as a key policy issue at COP. One specific thing we're going to be tracking and pushing on is the just transition mechanism that was agreed. The scope of the mechanism is broad. It's applicable to a range of sectors and policy areas. So we and partners will be pushing to ensure that as that mechanism is fleshed out over the course of this year, it does include concrete actions on the responsible and equitable management of transition minerals as a core part of a just transition. And this is a near-term push because inputs on that mechanism are due in 8 weeks, and a draft operational plan is expected by mid-year. On UNEA, I'd say the follow-up is about ensuring that those dialogues on minerals policy that were agreed, that they happen in a timely manner, that they include inputs from a diverse set of impacted stakeholders, that they set high socio-environmental standards linked to broader good governance norms, and really importantly, that they advance concrete policy measures and financial resources. Dialogues are an okay jumping off point, but it's certainly not the end goal. I do think there are a few other UN processes that will be important to watch this year. The UNIDO Global Alliance on Responsible and Green Minerals, also the UN Task Force on Critical Energy Transition Minerals that was announced at UNEA. These are both initiatives that have country support elements as part of the plan. So again, I think watching which countries and which regions are targeted is going to be something important. In terms of your question around the impacts of US withdrawal, I think practically speaking, many of the UN agencies working on transition mineral issues have already been grappling with US funding cuts and policy disengagement over the past year. So, I'm not sure if things like last week's memo will change that much. But over the past year, I think we have also seen that this combination of budget cuts, competing demands, geopolitical flux, it has constrained ambitions and it's constrained timelines for action. So there is this disconnect on the one hand of the central role of minerals for climate solutions, our knowledge that, poor mineral governance leads to projects delays. The fact that it's in the headlines, every week. But on the other hand, kind of these multilateral processes that aren't moving as quickly as they could, that aren't mobilizing the resources that they need to as quickly, and that sometimes aren't giving as much attention to governance issues even as in the past. So that's something that absolutely needs to shift, and it applies not just to the UN context. I think it's more broadly. I do think that it is also important to keep an eye on the multilateral spaces where the US remains. There were mineral initiatives that emerged from the South Africa G20, which of course the US skipped. So it will be very interesting to see if and how those initiatives are addressed when the G20 comes to Miami later this year.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
G7 is another space to watch. There's this G7 roadmap on international standards-based markets that the US has been involved with. So we'll have to see what happens there.
We will have to see what happens there. Well, thank you so much, Erica. I think this is a good place to leave this section of the panel at. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for taking part. I think I'll hand it back to Megan for some questions. I think we've got a few questions in the Q&A already. Please, put your questions in the chat and we'll try and get to them. Megan, do you want to take over for the Q&A?
Yes, thanks very much, Chloe. And just apologies for a few technical difficulties we had at the beginning in terms of getting the live stream onto LinkedIn, but quite a few people have joined on the Zoom call, plus others who are watching now on the LinkedIn live stream. So yes, we've got a few questions, and thank you for the insights already. A few are actually for Tulio, so I'm just going to wrap those ones together, and then we'll go back out to the broader picture again. So one question for you, Tulio, was how does Brazil plan to be involved in the Colombia conference to transition away from fossil fuels that Alex was talking about? And also for you, what are the next steps for the presidency in terms of fleshing out the global implementation accelerator and the Belém mission to 1.5C, which were obviously in the Mutirão decision at COP30. But I think there's, curiosity about what happens next with those. And also there was another question about what elements exactly, or maybe you can't say exactly, but in a bit more detail will be included in the presidency's roadmap that the COP president said will be taken forward before COP31. So if you could address all of those relatively briefly, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. So we have three roadmaps that we are going to be pushing. The fossil fuel and the forest, they are roadmaps on COP presidency's own initiative, and so far we are still getting together different stakeholders and see exactly how we ensure that we do not fragment efforts, but rather integrate everything together in a very synergic way, including, as Alex said, the conference in Santa Marta. So we hope to have information very, very soon. Then we have the roadmap on the mission on that we are going to keep doing with the COP29 presidency. And then we have two initiatives also. One is the Belém 1.5 mission 1.5 that we are going to foster together with COP29 and COP31 presidency. Naturally, this is a coordinated effort. And then the global implementation accelerator together with COP31. We are also in a dialogue with the COP31, but most importantly, from the COP30 presidency perspective, the Global Implementation Accelerator addresses exactly the need that Ambassador Andre uh, presented in his ninth letter on the need to reframe ambition towards accelerated implementation, and especially taking into account, on the one hand, the risks of irreversible and climate-induced tipping points, and the other, the fact that perhaps the only way that we can achieve the 1.5 is through positive tipping points. And to that, we feel that a lot of the action agenda experience was focused on positive tipping points, on how can we engage different actors towards that. And so we hope to continue that effort, most importantly, very much science-based and science-grounded, but together with positive tipping points. So this notion of sequencing, exponentiality, and cascading in transformation. And by sequencing, we also see a huge opportunity for the accelerator to focus on high impact initiatives that could serve as emergency brake and make us gain time. So methane and non-CO2 gases, ecosystem restoration, early warning, and building state capacities, because our institutions are not ready for climate change, especially tipping points.
Thanks so much, Tulio. There's a lot of detail there, and obviously a huge amount of work that's going to happen this year. I wanted to put another related question to Jennifer, which is, how can we ensure that the roadmap and the conference that's going to happen in Colombia speak to all actors beyond the usual suspects, to create a real kind of signal to the real world and also to financial markets? And then how can we ensure that the roadmap and related work actually lands back in the multilateral process, including at COP31, so that the work is rooted and a two-way process, which I think is something that the COP30 presidency stressed in the lead up to COP?
Well, I think, first of all, and it really will matter how the COP30 presidency and the incoming presidencies engage parties and non-state actors. So Tulio mentioned and Alex mentioned all of the different players that are involved: the financial, the economic, the development, also, of course, the indigenous, civil society, business communities. So I would think providing ideas for the presidencies, especially the Brazilian presidency, on how that could be done in an efficient way would be very important right now. And I would also think those institutions doing their own roadmaps. I think we need to make it the year that a roadmap is a word, but a roadmap is a course. It's a process. It's a multifaceted thing. It's not just a one single roadmap. And so catalyzing a whole series of roadmaps, I think, from different institutions, financial institutions, from different governments, having the Santa Marta conference, provide a platform for that, having the Brazilian presidency provide a platform for those different ideas, I think is one way to make sure that happens. But I think it really does need a formal drive also from the presidency. So my listening to Tulio, and my hope would be that there's enough capacity and time to be doing that as a priority there for both roadmaps, of course, not only the fossil fuel roadmap, but obviously many actors involved in both of those. I think the connection back to the COP, well, that would be, having the roadmap be present not only through all the climate weeks and all the different meetings, but also bringing it formally into the agenda. As we know, any party can put an agenda item on the agenda that the COP presidency will then have to deal with, the incoming presidency. So we'll see what happens in June on that. But I think maybe this last point, I think, right now the COP, and this was a question earlier from Chloe. I mean, we don't really have that many places anymore for real global collaboration where people come together for the solutions to climate change, accelerating the implementation, except for the COPs. The G7, the G20 can make important contributions in different ways, but with the Trump administration there, that will be difficult. And therefore, having platforms, hopefully in Turkey, for these discussions in many, many, many different ways, and getting those set up quickly for those solutions for dealing with the different challenges that are there, I think is another excellent way. So it really becomes the place to be, and where the solutions are found and the key issues of equity, indigenous, and human rights are also on the table.
Thanks, Jennifer. Tulio, did you have any response to those suggestions?
Absolutely. No, we are very very much determined to make this a collective effort, building on all the structure and experience that we did at COP30, because everything we've done, and perhaps the biggest deliverable of COP30 was actually to have climate action not being about the COP presidency, but actually all the stakeholders, all sectors. And this is the learning that we had in terms of also providing the biggest driver for resilience of the process, because once climate action is out of the COP and it's everywhere, and that's what we saw in Brazil. It means that one single country cannot stall climate action. Climate action is at all levels, and and naturally this must also be something that we have to foster in relation to all the roadmaps. I also saw in the chat, for example, one question about data centers. This is another very important dimension of the roadmap, the transition away from fossil fuel. At the same time that we have this major need for investments in the energy transition, we see that the digital critical infrastructure and AI is actually attracting hundreds of billions of dollars, which is exactly what we need, and trillions of dollars, exactly what we need for the energy transition. If this major infrastructure transformation does not happen unified with the climate transition, then the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, they're not going to be achievable. So we need absolutely to get the tech sector as well, because that's where we are seeing the most of investments, also technology. When we talk about the need for speed and scale, digital technologies here in Brazil, public digital infrastructure has transformed the Brazilian society and economic and banking ecosystem within years. The same happening with India, and in a way that also includes socially. So these are all dimensions that will be important for us to really engage and foster in our work ahead.
Thank you, Tulio. Yes, I did hear interesting comments at the International Renewable Energy Agency Assembly around AI and the huge demand for energy that will be related to AI data centers. People saying that renewables are basically the only way you can get that energy capacity in place fast enough to actually meet the demand, because you can provide it much quicker and much cheaper than by using fossil fuels. So yes, we will see if that comes to pass. I'm afraid we do not have a great deal more time. So I just wanted to go back to each speaker, if you can stay on for a few more minutes, just to give you a last chance to give an overall perspective. And I guess I wanted to pick up on what Alex mentioned, a phrase that he mentioned, which is, that we're sort of heading into this, I think he called it second gear of multilateralism, which, has changed perhaps in character and people's understanding of it in an age of another phrase that was used, resource imperialism. And I guess those two things are kind of very much setting the scene for 2026. And I just wanted to get the thoughts of all the speakers about where you see the best opportunity to push forward on climate action this year, given that that's the operating framework that we have to deal with. So first, I'd like to put that to Alex.
Thank you. I can't claim credit for the second gear. That was Tulio's idea. And I think it is what we need to see happen this year. And I think if we want to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, we are going to need to collaborate and cooperate. And so we are going to need to create structures for those that are interested in accelerating the transition to come together. So I think the key thing is we have to not be afraid of the forces arrayed against us and of the efforts by particularly the fossil fuel industry and the governments that they control across the world. And we have to demonstrate that we can begin to implement solutions. And I think the conference in Santa Marta is an invitation for people everywhere to make their submissions on how we can cooperate across borders and communities and countries to build new institutions, new forms of multilateralism that can serve us to make the transition fairer and faster.
Thanks, Alex. And I'll take it next to Erica. Erica, how do you see that playing out from the natural resources aspect of things? Because, you know, that's important both for the transition away from fossil fuels themselves, but also for building up the alternatives.
Absolutely. I think, you know, continuing to push to ensure that multilateral processes are as strong and resourced and engaging of civil society and broader stakeholders as they need to be in order to be ambitious is key. In the mining sector, given the amount of flux and uncertainty in the multilateral space, there is increasing focus on more tailored regional cooperation, especially regionalizing African mineral value chains. That's increasingly being seen as a key to maximizing both equitable benefits for developing producer countries, but also advancing a just transition on the continent and globally. So we're going to be focusing a lot of attention on the practical steps that are needed to address some of the implementation gaps that remain there.
Thanks, Erica. And Tulio, obviously you have a lot on your plate this year. What will your priorities be in the next few months?
Absolutely. It's about understanding that we are transitioning in terms of every single dimension of human existence. It's not only the climate transition, it's our technology, our information systems, our economies, geopolitics, which is the very focus of this conversation, and the strength and resilience in our capacity of the climate regime and our capacity to strengthen and accelerate and connect to people. Implementation will be measured by our capacity to operate in this context of transitions. And it's about also making multilateralism, using climate multilateralism to spearhead an evolution in climate, in global cooperation as a whole, because global cooperation is not ready for the challenges of the 21st century.
Jennifer, do you feel optimistic that we will be able to see global cooperation show that it can become readier for the challenges of the 21st century in the coming months?
Sometimes, if I'm honest with everyone, I think really maybe building on the other speakers, I mean, I think we are in a massive, massive moment of disruption. And you can deal with disruption either by trying to go back into what is business as usual and kind of muddling through, or you can step into the disruption, see it as a moment to make big changes that need to be made. Because the rules, I mean, the multilateral rules, we want the international rules and norms, but how the old traditional alliances have worked, that's over. And so I think also having had such a strong COP in Brazil, you know, and the leadership that's going to be coming in the coming years from basic and BRICS country leading COPs, I just think it's really time to, number one, really reaffirm and redefine the COP in a way that it is about accelerating that implementation, that it is the place to go, but then to create the spaces for the creativity for that collaboration to happen in many, many different ways, and the courage for that to occur. And that's not only a government thing, that's also a private sector thing. I think the coming years are just absolutely critical for people to come together and feel that they are part of this much bigger effort, mucho rao, not just a moment, longer time period, so that the other view of the world, the Trump view of the world, is isolated. But that will take work, and I'm optimistic because I know a lot of people who are fantastically working on this, but massive endeavor.
Absolutely, indeed. Thank you so much to everybody. What I'm hearing is a lot of courage of people's convictions here and a lot of determination. And even though we know 2026 won't be an easy year, there are a lot of plans and momentum that will be coming forward. And so we look forward to covering the fruits of your work at Climate Home News. And I'll just finish by thanking our speakers so much, and just to let everybody know that the video of this call, of this event, will be made available on LinkedIn if people would like to watch it back and share. And if you do have a few spare dollars, please do consider subscribing to Climate Home News, because it's a tough time for climate journalism as well right now. But we know that it's needed more than ever. So thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in 2026. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Mhm.